In the summer of 1941, the Japanese Empire was not at war with the United States. No bombs were falling on Tokyo, no American soldiers were firing shots in the Pacific. On the surface, peace still existed. But inside the halls of power in Tokyo, the atmosphere was turning desperate, because Japan was running out of time and no amount of military strength could stop the clock. Japan was an empire built on steel, ships, and aircraft. Its navy was among the most powerful in the world. Its army had conquered vast territories across Asia, but beneath this appearance of strength lay a fatal weakness. Japan had almost no oil of its own. Every battleship, every aircraft carrier, every fighter plane depended on fuel imported from abroad. By 1941, nearly 80% of Japan's oil came from a single source, the United States. It was an invisible dependency, easy to ignore during times of peace. But it meant that Japan's war machine, no matter how large, ultimately ran on American fuel. And in Washington, this fact was about to be weaponized. In July 1941, without firing a single shot, the United States made a quiet but devastating move. In response to Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia, President Franklin D. Roosevelt froze Japanese assets and effectively cut off oil exports to Japan. Overnight, the fuel that powered Japan's empire stopped flowing. Inside Japan's leadership, the calculations were immediate and brutal. Existing oil reserves could sustain the military for roughly 18 months. After that, the navy would be immobilized, aircraft would be grounded. The empire would collapse without a decisive battle ever being fought. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether Japan would go to war, but how and where it would strike first. In Tokyo, the embargo turned abstract geopolitics into an immediate crisis. Senior officers and ministers gathered around maps, shipping tables, and fuel estimates. This was no longer about ideology or pride, it was about arithmetic. Every month that passed without oil imports brought Japan closer to paralysis. Delay itself had become a strategic threat. At the center of this crisis stood Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a career military officer facing an impossible dilemma. To accept American demands meant withdrawing from China and abandoning years of conquest. To reject them meant confronting a superior industrial power with a shrinking fuel supply. There was no option without catastrophe. Inside the imperial conferences, Japan's leadership debated two futures. One path offered humiliation without war. The other offered war with a slim chance of survival. Japan's generals understood that once their oil reserves were gone, resistance would be impossible. If war was inevitable, they argued, it had to begin while Japan could still fight on its own terms. The logic was cold but consistent. Japan could not defeat the United States in a long war, but it might shock it. A decisive strike could buy time to seize oil fields in Southeast Asia and fortify a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The goal was not victory, but leverage, enough pressure to force a negotiated peace before fuel ran out. By the autumn of 1941, diplomacy continued in public, but the real decisions had already been made in private. As talks dragged on in Washington, Japanese planners prepared for war. The embargo had transformed Pearl Harbor from a gamble into a calculation. It was no longer an act of aggression alone, it was a race against an empty tank. The responsibility for turning this calculation into action fell on one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto understood something many politicians refused to accept. Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industry was simply too vast. If war came, it had to begin with a single, overwhelming blow. Yamamoto's plan was radical and deeply risky. He proposed striking the United States not at the edges of its empire, but at its heart in the Pacific. By destroying the American fleet in one surprise attack, Japan could buy the time it desperately needed. Time to seize oil fields in the south, time to fortify its defenses, time to survive. Many within Japan's leadership opposed the idea. The distance was extreme, the risks were enormous. Failure would mean immediate disaster. But the embargo had stripped Japan of safer alternatives. Every delay burned fuel that could not be replaced. In this new reality, the greatest danger was hesitation. Boldness was no longer ambition. It was necessity. Pearl Harbor was chosen not because it was symbolic, but because it was practical. It housed the core of American naval power in the Pacific. If those ships could be sunk at anchor, the United States would need years to rebuild. Years Japan no longer had, the target was not territory. It was time. By late November 1941, Japanese carrier groups slipped quietly into the Pacific, sailing east under strict radio silence. Officially, negotiations with the United States continued. Unofficially, Japan had already crossed the point of no return. The embargo had done its work. The war would begin not with diplomacy failing, but with fuel running out. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor through clear Hawaiian skies. Battleships burned at anchor. Aircraft were destroyed before they could take off. In a matter of hours, the United States Pacific Fleet was crippled. From a purely tactical perspective, the attack was a stunning success. In Tokyo, the news was met with relief and celebration. The impossible had been achieved. Japan had struck first. The American fleet lay in ruins. For a brief moment, it appeared that Yamamoto's gamble had worked. Time had been bought. The empire could now move south to seize the oil fields it desperately needed. But beneath the surface of victory lay a fatal irony. The most important American assets at Pearl Harbor were not destroyed. The aircraft carriers were at sea. The fuel storage tanks were left untouched. And the industrial heart of the United States remained completely intact. What Japan had destroyed was impressive, but it was not decisive. Worse still, the attack achieved the opposite of its political goal. Instead of forcing negotiation, it unified American public opinion overnight. Isolationism collapsed. Congress declared war almost unanimously. The industrial power Japan had hoped to intimidate was now fully mobilized, unleashed without restraint. For Japan's leaders, this was the nightmare scenario they had hoped to avoid. The United States was not negotiating. It was transforming. American factories shifted to wartime production almost overnight. Shipyards expanded, steel output exploded, and the world's largest economy began converting its civilian abundance into military power. Japan had struck first, but now it faced an enemy with resources beyond calculation. Yet in Tokyo, the generals believed time was still on their side. The attack on Pearl Harbor had bought them a critical window, perhaps 6 months, before American power could be fully felt in the Pacific. If Japan could seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia and fortify a defensive perimeter, they believed the United States would accept a negotiated peace rather than fight a long and costly war. This belief shaped everything that followed. Japanese forces surged southward with astonishing speed. The Philippines fell, Malaya collapsed. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in humiliation. Each victory shocked the world and reinforced Tokyo's conviction that their gamble was working. The empire expanded not for conquest alone, but to reach the resource base that would keep its military alive. By early 1942, Japanese troops entered the Dutch East Indies, home to some of the richest oil fields in the world. For the first time since the embargo, Japan had access to the fuel it desperately needed. Oil wells were captured intact. Refineries resumed operation. On maps in Tokyo, the crisis appeared solved. The empire now possessed the energy to sustain its war. But oil in the ground does not win wars. Oil must move. Every barrel extracted in Borneo or Sumatra had to be transported thousands of miles across open ocean to reach Japan's factories, airfields, and fleets. And those sea lanes now passed directly through waters controlled by a newly awakened American Navy, armed with an industrial base Japan could never match. The United States did not rush to dramatic surface battles. Instead, it waged a quieter, more methodical campaign. American submarines were deployed along Japan's shipping routes with a singular mission: strangle the flow of oil. One tanker sunk did more damage than a destroyed battleship. Fuel lost at sea could never be replaced. By 1944, the effects were catastrophic. Japanese pilots received only a fraction of the training hours their American counterparts enjoyed. Warships remained in port, unable to sail. Aircraft were grounded not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Japan had won control of oil fields, but lost control of the oceans that made those resources usable. In the end, Pearl Harbor did not save Japan. It merely delayed collapse. The embargo had forced Tokyo into a desperate gamble, and that gamble had failed. The empire that attacked to secure its survival discovered that industrial warfare obeys unforgiving mathematics. Resources matter, but logistics decide everything. World War II in the Pacific was not ultimately decided by courage or strategy alone. It was decided by energy, production, and supply chains. By the time the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japan was already running out of time. The attack was not the beginning of the war. It was the sound of an empire burning its last reserves. The greatest irony of the Pacific War is that Japan achieved exactly what it set out to do and still lost. The embargo forced Tokyo into action. Pearl Harbor bought time. Southeast Asia delivered oil. Yet none of it mattered once the United States converted its economic scale into military reality. Japan was not defeated by a single battle, but by an imbalance that no victory could correct. American shipyards launched vessels faster than Japan could destroy them. Oil tankers, cargo ships, aircraft carriers, and submarines poured into the Pacific in numbers never seen before. Every Japanese loss was permanent. Every American loss was temporary. This asymmetry defined the war long before Midway, Guadalcanal, or Leyte Gulf entered the history books. By late 1944, the Japanese war machine was hollow. Pilots flew on minimal fuel. Ships sailed only when absolutely necessary. Entire squadrons existed on paper but could not operate. The empire that had expanded to secure resources now lacked the means to use them. The embargo had done what bombs alone could not. It had reduced a modern military to paralysis. In retrospect, Pearl Harbor was not a reckless act of aggression. It was a calculated response to strategic suffocation. Japan's leaders believed they were facing extinction without war. They chose to gamble everything on a single shock, hoping the United States would hesitate. What they misunderstood was not American anger, but American capacity. The Pacific War reveals an uncomfortable truth about modern conflict. Nations do not fight when they are strong. They fight when they believe time is running out. Japan attacked not because it was confident, but because it was cornered. The embargo did not start the war, but it closed every other path. This is why oil mattered more than soldiers. Armies can endure losses. Nations can survive defeat. But when energy disappears, everything stops. Factories fall silent, fleets remain in harbor, air power vanishes from the sky. Control of oil was not a strategic advantage. It was the difference between survival and collapse. World War II is often remembered as a clash of ideologies, flags, and leaders. But beneath those symbols lay a colder reality. The war followed pipelines, shipping lanes, and fuel depots. The side that could deny energy did not need to win every battle. It only needed to wait. Japan did not lose because it lacked courage or skill. It lost because it fought an industrial war without industrial depth. The embargo exposed this weakness. Pearl Harbor tried to overcome it. Neither could change the arithmetic of power. The Pacific War was decided not on December 7, 1941, but months earlier, when the oil stopped flowing. Everything that followed was motion already set in place. Battles were fought. Cities burned. Empires collapsed. But the outcome had been locked in by a resource decision few civilians noticed at the time. History rarely announces its turning points with explosions. More often, it does so with paperwork, signatures, and supply disruptions. The embargo was quiet. Pearl Harbor was loud. Yet it was the silence of empty fuel tanks that ended the war. If we want to understand how wars truly begin, we must look beyond declarations and invasions. We must look at pressure points, at chokeholds, at moments when a nation realizes that peace no longer offers survival. World War II was not decided by who had the bravest soldiers. It was decided by who controlled energy, production, and time. Japan attacked when the oil ran out. America won because it never did. This is not just a lesson of the past. It is the pattern of power itself. If you disagree with this story, say why. If you agree, explain what it changes about the way you see the war. History isn't written by those who memorize it. It's written by those who question it. I'll be reading the comments. Subscribe if you want to see what history hides next.